The National Basketball Association is celebrating its 75th anniversary, and here to talk about that anniversary is a very special person, a great sports reporter and pioneer in the world of stats, and that's Dave Heeren. Dave, good morning. How are you?
Well, I'm happy to be here, Bob. Really, I enjoy this so much. It's my history. I love it.
Oh, 100%. And I think it's so great to be able to have you on the show. You grew up in the New York City area. Your first job was as a statistician with the New York Knicks. And you've got this great book out right now called 75, which celebrates the 75th anniversary. Tell us a little bit about that. And then also a statistical platform that basically is still used to this day. We'll get to that in just a moment. But tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, I think you're thinking about Tendex when you mentioned that. Well, it really did start with Tendex. I went to the University of Delaware. Sophomore year, I became a sports writer for the school paper. I went to a basketball game, and that guy's not that good. I was thinking about the guy who was the team's leading scorer. He averaged 18 points a game. He was all conference. Then I looked at another guy. He was averaging maybe 10 points, but he was doing all kinds of other stuff. And I just put together this formula, not just for points, but for the other good stuff, and then subtracted bad stuff like missed shots. And lo and behold, it turned out this guy who's leading the team in scoring was not the best player. He was missing a lot of shots and not doing much else. And this led to Tendex. When I wrote it up for the school newspaper, it got picked up by the Wilmington Morning News, and they in turn, the columnists there wrote about it, and it grew. And pretty soon, instead of having 5 points into it, it was 10. So I called it Tendex. And later on, it was more like 15. It got more complicated, but you wanted to get it right. And you wanted to count everything that you could into the formula. And that's the way it worked out.
And amazing in these days, Dave, because everything really has become so statistical based when we talk about players and greatness and the conversations of being able to evaluate one era from another era. And hopefully that's something that we can chat about a little bit this morning.
Yeah, but you can do that. And actually, I'm not a traditionalist from the standpoint, I don't worship the old guys, and I am one. But the truth is, the NBA wasn't a very good league for about the first 10 years. Until the 24-second rule, and then they started attracting athletes, and it went up from there.
No, and I think that's a great place to start because, we start talking about the 75th anniversary and all the great players. And as someone that works oftentimes with younger students, whether it's at the TV station here at BronxNet or at WFUV with the radio station, the conversation always tends to lean in the direction of the players, the current players. And even sometimes it's amazing for me, Dave, how easy it is for a young person, someone even 20 years old, to forget about how great Michael Jordan was. But then you think about it and you say to yourself, they've never seen Michael Jordan play.
Well, you can imagine how it was with people like Oscar Robertson and Will Chamberlain. Let's forget it. We'll just join the Red Auerbach Club and just say that Bill Russell was the greatest. Well, Bill Russell wasn't. But Red Auerbach was a great promoter, and Russell was his player. But Chamberlain and Robertson were better players than Russell. Not on better teams. The Celtics won, but they were better individual players.
I was curious, at least from a New York City perspective, especially since you've been watching basketball since 1947, and of course have compiled all these great books and articles and records and stuff. Where would you place Kareem Abdul Jabbar as someone out of New York?
Yeah, he's right up there. I mean, he's the next center after Chamberlain, and there's not that big a gap. Abdul Jabbar was definitely a top 6 or 7 of all time. I mean, he was way up there, and that's including not just the centers. The centers, he'd be number 2, and that's mainly because Chamberlain was stronger. Abdul Jabbar was a touch player. He could shoot great, but Chamberlain was so strong he could just, well, you've seen Shaq. The difference between Chamberlain and Shaq was that Chamberlain had a fingertip touch too. He wasn't just bam, bam, and he had a fingertip touch besides. But the man was a monster physically. Yeah.
A finesse player. And interesting too, because, we mentioned Michael Jordan, and in my book, at least in my lifetime, he's the greatest player I have ever seen. And And that includes watching someone like LeBron James or Steph Curry or Kevin Durant, some of the current stars. I still would place Jordan atop my list, but definitely as someone that loves the history of basketball, I'm going to have some of those great names on my top 5 or top 10. And I think it's interesting that your first NBA draft was actually that amazing 1984 draft. Tell us how that got going.
Yeah, that was the best of all. Well, it just so happened that by that time, I had started to do a column for a basketball publication and also the sporting news. And so Tendex was becoming known. And that was the first time I used Tendex to rate a draft. It's not easy because you have to also have rate of improvement along with the flat stats. So a guy like Michael Jordan, who was not that great in high school, then in college he goes like this, but before, and he's still going like that in the NBA. A lot of people say, well, he won all those titles. Well, he didn't win titles. His team did. It was the same like with Russell's team. Jordan did not actually start winning titles until his peak years were over. But that's because along came Pippen, and then along came Rodman, and along came Kukoc. So he had some teammates. But in the beginning, he didn't have any teammates. And you got to have teammates. You got to have teammates.
And for a decade, you pretty much had, which makes sense, because I think my compadre, Chris Busateri, my editor, that's on this call with us right now, even though the fans at home never get a chance to actually see him. We would often talk about how LeBron James is arguably the MVP year in and year out in the NBA. And even if, in my book, even if I have MJ above him, there's no denying his greatness. And for a decade, in your book, LeBron James, statistically best player in the NBA. And it's not until more recent years, I know you had James Harden kind of supplanting him at one point, right, in Houston, and more recently, guys like Kevin Durant in that conversation. What makes LeBron James so special, and what do you think about this new crop of players that have come into the league? Is there some player now that you would have at the very top above him?
Oh, okay, just the new players. Harden and Durant are at the top of that list, and they ranked number 5 and 6 on the all-time list. Great players, but there's a gap between them and the top 4. The top 4, Jordan, you're talking about LeBron James, Robertson, and Chamberlain, and they were by far the top 4. And the old-timers who saw Chamberlain and Robertson will tell you that. Bill Raftery, if he's still alive today, will tell you that. Nobody liked Robertson. John Wooden, age 99, congratulated LeBron on winning a high school all-star trophy and said, this guy is the best high school player I've seen since Robertson. So he's going way back. And I don't think it's coincidental, because these two guys then and these two now, Jordan and James, are the best. And it's hard to pick among them, but you want to start your team with those 4.
Well, we definitely have your Mount Rushmore here on the show, which is great. And that's obviously, of course, going to be such a big debate when it comes to NBA fans. For you, Dave, especially with being someone that's been a passionate and lifelong basketball fan, when did you start to realize that this system that you created was the way to go? Was it back in college when you were at Delaware?
No, I didn't even think it was going anywhere outside of the campus. But little by little, and by the time in the mid-'80s, when I got to write with the sporting news, I said, whoa. And I was getting a lot of attention. People wanted to know, well, how do you do this Tendex? Because Tendex was doing better than the NBA scouts on drafting. And that was undisputable, the 84 draft. Tendex had it in this order: Jordan, Olajuwon, Stockton, Barkley. The scouts had Olajuwon, then they had a stiff center. I forget who he was. Jordan was number 3, and then you had Barkley and Stockton. So right there, you had a huge start for Tendex, and it went on from there.
That was part 1 of our interview with NBA pioneer Dave Heeren. Tune in next week for part 2.